Welcome to Books of Titans. I'm Jason Staples together with Erik Rostad, and this podcast is dedicated to the influences of influencers. The books that have helped shape prominent inventors, business leaders, athletes, intellectual scientists, and others. And we'll talk about what makes these books so important and influential, and at least attempt to have an intelligent discussion about these important works. Today we're going to cover The Things They Carried, a book about war set in the Vietnam War. Chase Jarvis is the one who recommended the book in Tools of Titans. Jarvis is the CEO of CreativeLive.com and one of the most successful commercial photographers in the world. You can follow him on Instagram at Chase Jarvis, ChaseJarvis.
The author of The Things They Carried is Tim O'Brien. He's a Minnesota native, and Minnesota comes up in the book a few times. He also served in the Vietnam War. He joined a division that contained a unit involved in the My Lai massacre, which was a horrific incident with U.S. soldiers just pretty much taking out an entire village. And he joined after that massacre happened. After the war, he went to Harvard. So we're going to jump right to the section of our favorite quotes. And I've got a few favorites in there. The first one is a relatively long one, but I'll just start it off here. All of us, I suppose, like to believe that in a moral emergency, we would behave like the heroes of our youth, bravely and forthrightly, without thought of personal loss or discredit. If the stakes ever became high enough, if the evil were ever evil enough, if the good were good enough, I would simply tap a secret reservoir of courage that had been accumulating inside over the years. Courage, I seem to think, comes to us in finite quantities, like an inheritance. And by being frugal and stashing it away and letting it earn interest, we steadily increase our moral capital in preparation for that day when the account must be drawn down. It was a comforting theory. It dispensed with all those bothersome little acts of daily courage. It offered hope and grace to the repetitive coward. It justified the past while amortizing the future. And that was just an amazing quote, hitting on a lot of topics we've discussed in some of the other books. But this idea that you just if you live your life hoping that in the moment where you need courage, it's just going to suddenly arrive without doing any preparation beforehand. He says it's a comforting theory, but it doesn't work. And we actually see an example of that in this book. Where he relates not saving to someone during a war to an action he didn't take when he was a kid. I've got that listed as something I want to get into later, but I just thought he nailed that with courage on that quote there. Did that one stick out to you as well, Jason?
Yeah, it was a good one. I mean, I think it gets in large measure to one of the main themes of the book, which is that war is fundamentally human, and that these are flawed human beings who fight wars, and that glorifying it and glorifying the deeds of those heroes at war to some degree diminishes their humanness, and dealing with the reality of what it is to be human and dealing with the reality of war forces us to deal with the reality of what it is to be human. So I think that quote gets to a lot of what his writing here is trying to get at as well.
Yeah. I liked one other quote in the book, and this quote was about blame. And again, it's a long one. I'm just going to read the paragraph. When a man died, there had to be blame. Jimmy Cross understood this. You could blame the war. You could blame the idiots who made the war. You could blame Kiowa for going to it. You could blame the rain. You could blame the river. You could blame the field, the mud, the climate. You could blame the enemy. You could blame the mortar rounds. You could blame people who were too lazy to read a newspaper, who were bored by the daily body counts, who switched channels at the mention of politics. You could blame the whole nations. You could blame God. You could blame the munitions makers or Karl Marx or a trick of fate or an old man in Omaha who forgot to vote. In the field, however, though, the causes were immediate. A moment of carelessness or bad judgment or plain stupidity carried consequences that lasted forever. That was a tough one. I mean, here you got who can we blame for the war? Can we blame people who don't read the newspaper or the leaders? We can talk about all this blame, but when you're in the actual field, one moment of carelessness or bad judgment or plain stupidity carried consequences that lasted forever. And I think it's also kind of captured the book. He just had a great way of talking about deep issues with war and difficult topics, but in a way that that made you think about it differently. And we'll get into that with even the first chapter and how he talks about war. But I thought that was a neat passage there about who do you blame in a war, and especially when you're the soldier and it's your decisions carry huge consequences.
Yeah, and again, that is a theme throughout this book, is just how even small things, even the a single momentary lapse can be something that changes the course of history in terms of someone's life, in terms of all these other things, and how war magnifies the consequences of every decision, because everything is blown up, no pun intended, but everything is made so much larger, and the amount of time that you have to make these decisions is shrunk so much that war ends up being a window into humanity in how he writes all this stuff, and I think again that's the window, that's how his book should be understood. Getting into my quotes, little bit different. I got two here. One is about his this character Rat Kiley, and he's explaining Rat's penchant for exaggeration. And he said, he had a reputation for exaggeration and overstatement. So they said, for most of us, it was normal procedure to discount 60 or 70% of anything he had to say. If Rat told you, for example, that he'd slept with 4 girls one night, you could figure it was about a girl and a half. Which, that kind of works for me. I mean, that math is entertaining at any rate. And the other one really, in a lot of respects, again, hits the one of the prime themes of the book once again, and it's just 2 words: death sucks.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's hard to get more profundity in many respects than that. I mean, that's toward the end of the book, and one of his characters just comes to this realization: death sucks. And again, this book really tries to force the reader to come to grapple with the reality of human mortality, with the fact that people die. Like, not like characters in a movie die, but like people actually, like real people, like they die. We all die. And you can kind of hear him at different points, like trying to get people to realize that, like, no, really, no, people die. Like death, it's a thing. It's really bad. It exists, and we have to deal with that. And over and over and over again, you keep coming back to that concept, and that concept particularly in the context of war. But so much of the book is trying to grapple with that fact. Death sucks, man.
And in the context of both losing friends and taking life yourself in the case of war.
Yeah,
and,
killing
and how
enemies.
difficult it is.
Yeah. Which again, how is he my enemy? He's just like me, and he's just out trying to do his job. Neither one of us has anything against each other.
Mm-hmm.
But somehow now he's dead and I'm not. And now how do I deal with that? Because it's just me right there, and now he's dead. Yeah, it's an interesting book in that regard, and it's a sobering read in a lot of ways, because of that constant drumbeat of bringing us back to something that, as he points out in a few cases, we really try so hard to ignore that reality. We try so hard not to think about death. And we even try to sanitize what war is like, and we make it heroic, right?
Yeah.
As in your first quote, like, we believe that we'll behave like heroes. But the reality is, like, it's just people killing one another, like people dying. And how is that heroic, right? And he's getting to the bottom of that. And the thing is, he doesn't answer in a comforting way, because in how he answers, there are times where it can be heroic, and it is heroic, but it's still killing somebody. And now what? Like, what does that tell us? Like, how do we handle that?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's a really interesting book in that respect. So, and I think that 2-word quote toward the end of the book again highlights that. So I think we can transition now, talk a little bit more, I suppose, about the book itself, more in the big picture, and some of the details there. So I know you had a couple that you wanted to hit right away. So let's hit it.
Yeah, and for any of the listeners that haven't read the book, it's a really unique setup. I have not read a book like this before. I'm sure there's many out there, but it's a collection of stories, of war stories. But you go back into the person's life, and then you see the person's life after the war, and then during the war. But it's what's called metafiction, or do you know how to pronounce the other word there?
Yeah. You want metafiction, or
in the second part there?
Verisimilitude.
Okay. So the whole time you're kind of wondering, is this fiction or nonfiction? And for me, I hadn't come across a book like this, but it's a collection of short stories that are tied together in this sort of a metafiction aspect, where Tim O'Brien, the author, his name is mentioned, and he's talking about it as if this is exactly what happened, but he's writing in a way where it's not like an exact replication of what happened in the war or in his life, but it's this blurred line between fiction and nonfiction. And the way he did it, I just found it very, very intriguing, and it helped to bring a lot of the points home in the book.
Yeah, I mean, I actually wasn't sure initially when I was reading it. It was one of those things that he kept, and initially he does present it. It's almost like it is reality, and then you do find out, like, later, no, he's making most of this up.
Mm-hmm.
But then that's the key, right? It's most of it. And then you have to figure, like, if you're really trying to do this and trying to analyze, you go, well, what part is he making up versus not?
Mm-hmm.
And then you say, oh, well, you can't really get to that. And that's part of the point.
Yeah.
And he has this discussion, which we'll talk about a little bit later, about the difference between truth, a true story, and, something that actually happened. So, happening truth, and story truth. And, we'll address that in a little bit, but he wants to get to this where he's getting to the reality of how things work. He's getting to the essence of things by writing stories that are sort of true to life, based on a true story. It's something that is based on something that happened either to him or to somebody else or whatever. And then he gets imaginative with it to get across the feel more than the details, right? He's not trying to write history. He's not trying to write a true story in the sense of, like, what happened, but he's trying to write what happened. So he's trying to help people understand what happened and get the feel of it.
Well, it made me think of when you're watching a movie and the very first credit thing to come up in the movie is based upon a true story.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, there's going to be aspects of the actual story, but it's being told in a way that perhaps it's enhancing the truth of the story, or it's just doing a Hollywood thing. But he gets into that of the story truth versus the happening truth, and what could be truer in different circumstances. And even just for a war story, telling it just straight exactly what happened might not be as true as a different way of telling the story.
Well, true meaning what, right? That's what he's trying to get at, is like, what does true mean here? Like when I say a story is true, like what exactly does that mean? Right. And what is really interesting about that is most people might answer with the question of, or might answer that question with the response, well, a true story is when you tell something and, you know, what you say happened. So the details are right. But the thing is, I can take a story and reshape it and get all the details right and completely change how you should understand the story to the point where I've distorted what actually happened. Right? You can talk about like, you can describe a car accident, and you can say, well, this car made contact. So the the back car made contact with the front car, and the trunk of the front car was crumpled, causing significant damage to the front car. Right? All of those are correct details. It's exactly what happened. And I said it that way in such a way as to suggest that the front car was rear-ended. But what if the actual thing that happened is that the front car backed into the car that was behind it? Those two cars still made contact in that way. The trunk was still compacted. But if I just said the front car backed into the back car, that totally changes things. And it's a truer story in the sense of getting at not only the details, but the why and the how of things than piling on all sorts of extraneous details that may or may not be relevant to actually understanding what happened in a more narrative sense. And, you know, this is something that I don't think people often appreciate, is the way that this happens in news. This happens all the time in terms of anytime you tell a story, you have to choose which details to tell, how to tell it. And all of that is you shaping what the story actually says. Because the reality is, like, based on a true story, you know, a movie based on the true story. Well, a movie is limited by what? How long is a typical movie? What, a longer movie now would be 2.5 hours, which I still think we should move back to, like, having an intermission for some of those. You know, for some of us guys who are maybe not in our 20s anymore, and you know, it'd be nice to have that intermission in the middle of some of these longer, you know, tentpole movies that are pushing 3 hours now. And you know, let's get back to the days of Ben-Hur and you know, these types of things where you might as well just put an intermission in there so everybody can at least, you know, breathe for a second, and all the other things that might happen in an intermission for 5 minutes. But anyway, let's say you go maximum 3 hours and you're talking about something that happened over, say, 3 years. Well, what you can't do is show a play-by-play, word-by-word replay of everything that happened over those 3 years. You have to be very selective with what details you choose to show. And what if there are other things that, you know, you might run out of time with to show? So what you do is you say, well, we're going to invent this character that didn't exist, who's going to be kind of a pastiche of these 8 characters that had these various roles, so that the audience can kind of follow along with what was actually happening, but they don't need to know all the details of these 8 different lives that are important here. What they need to know is that this was driven by this. And we're going to invent this so that we're going to invent this character so that we can have all those actions sewed up in one person, and that'll cut, you know, another hour off of screen time. And then we're going to eliminate these couple events because they weren't really that important. And so you eventually get down to where you can pare it all the way down to the 3 hours. And this is what you see anytime a book is made into a movie, but the book itself is a shortened version of what happened in reality. Mm-hmm. And it's choosing those details.
It's the 2 quotes you had later on here, where the author is talking about a person that he killed, and he tells it in the story version, and then he tells it in the happening truth. And I thought that was a good distinction of how he was talking about that.
Yeah, he makes that distinction here. I'll go ahead and read it from our notes. he says, first of all, he says, in talking about happening truth, I'm going to read through several different quotes from different places in the book. He says, a thing may happen and be a total lie. Another thing may not happen and be truer than the truth. Which I think the way he puts that is, I think, a little questionable. I wouldn't say it that way myself. But I think what he's getting at is that you can tell a story that is a true story in that it describes accurately the way things happened or happen. And then something else may actually happen that isn't generally the way things work. And if we just focus on that one point, we're actually not getting the truth of how the world works or whatever. So I think that's where he's going with that. But anyway, he says then by telling stories, you objectify your own experience, you separate it from yourself, you pin down certain truths. So that when you're telling stories, you pin down certain truths, you make up others. You start sometimes with an incident that truly happened, like the night in the blank field, and the caca field, and you carry it forward by inventing incidents that did not in fact occur, but nevertheless help to clarify and explain. So that gets back to what I was just talking about there. And he says his objective in writing the way he writes is, I want you to feel what I felt when he's at war. I want you to know why story truth is truer sometimes than happening truth, just relating the facts. Yeah. And then he explains, here is the happening truth. I was once a soldier. There were many bodies, real bodies with real faces, but I was young then and I was afraid to look. And now, 20 years later, I'm left with faceless responsibility and faceless grief. Here is the story truth. He was a slim, dead, almost dainty young man of about 20. He lay in the center of a red clay trail near the village of Maike. His jaw was in his throat. His one eye was shut. The other was a star-shaped hole. I killed him. And the emotional gravitas of the second one, immediately jumps out at you.
Yeah.
And he's saying, no, did all those details happen? Is this, a story of exactly how I killed this person? No, but I killed a lot of people just like this representative example that I'm making up in this moment. And I want you to feel what that feels like. And he's really getting at something important in how he does that. And frankly, actually, again, in my field, this is something that we talk about a lot. I mean, people in a lot of religious contexts are they would prefer not to think of their religious texts as working this way, but the Bible does this. You have lots of examples in which the Bible is clearly shaping the happening truth to get at the story truth that the narrator wants to relay. And the question is, of course, for the reader, for the religious person, well, how do we deal with that? Like, is it really true then? Like, is this false? Well, again, you have to understand what truth is to be able to answer that question at all. And really, truth in the way that these stories are what they're trying to convey. The question is what they are trying to convey true more than anything else? The happening truth is ancillary, because events can be, any event can be relevant or irrelevant depending on the story. And then the question is the story true? Is it actually accurately representing the way that life works? Is it representing the way that things were in the time that it's actually telling of? It's a different question.
Yeah. Well, in those two examples you just read, where the one is kind of the facts, like here's the facts that happened. I tune that when you're saying that, I kind of tune it out. So, okay, this is just another example of what happens in war. But that second one, where I had chills when you finish reading that, because it's like, oh my gosh, can you imagine the guilt of that, and having that 20 years later, having that vision of the person you killed in your head, and wondering every day, like, who was this guy? What did he do? Had he just left his family to go to war? All these different questions. And I think that really captures it so well in that second one compared to the first one. But maybe a lot of war books are going to be written more of, here's what happened. Here's the battle that took place. Here's how many died. Here's who died on each side. Here's how many wounded.
These were the strategies that were in play, and here were the mistakes by the people on the one side and why they lost the war, and then here were the things that were done on the other side that led to the success. And look at the great bravery, Pickett's charge, and how they all, they fought to the death in this way. Mm-hmm. And what O'Brien's getting at is, as often as not, those stories are not actually true in how they represent war. And what he's trying to say in these stories is war is not like that. War, just like human beings, just like real life, is much messier than that, much more awful than that. And until we grapple with that reality, we're going to keep running into some of the same problems. And again, I think he's very clearly trying to get people to consider the cost much more when thinking about war. Saying, guys, when you're sending people away, when politicians vote to send people to war, here's what's actually happening. You see these nice diagrams of this armored division moving in and doing this, but this is actually what it's like for an individual who's there. And war is forcing that upon a lot of people, and all these lives are going to be ended or changed irrevocably because of these horrible things that are being done in war. Mm-hmm. And his case, I think, is very much that, and he talks about it, that that a war story, this is early on in, I think, the second chapter, maybe a little bit later. I'm sorry, no, it's How to Tell a True War Story. So this is what the fourth chapter. So he says, a true war story is never moral. It does not instruct, nor encourage virtue, nor suggest models of proper human behavior, nor restrain men from doing the things men have always done. If a story seems moral, do not believe it. If at the end of a war story you feel uplifted, or if you feel that some small bit of rectitude has been salvaged from the larger waste, then you have been made the victim of a very old and terrible lie. There is no rectitude whatsoever. You can tell a true war story by its absolute and uncompromising allegiance to obscenity and evil. That's his case, which, by the way, interestingly, it is sort of self-refuting, because that is the instruction, that is the moral, and he's willing to have that self-refuting aspect there to make the larger point that war is nonsense. War is obscene and evil, and basically, until you recognize that, and until you're telling your war stories come out with that, what's going to happen is you're going to tell war stories, and young men are going to want to go to war. Mm-hmm. And he goes, and if anybody wants to go to war, well, maybe it hasn't been maybe it hasn't been adequately represented. And then on the other side of his mouth, he talks about how, well, there is some beauty in war. Paradoxically, it's that horrible thing,
and
right?
That's the neat thing, is he's talking about war, the overall war, and the horror of war, and war's hell. But then he brings it down to the individual level on multiple occasions. And in one time that he did this, was he traced acts of courage in war back to early childhood, and with the quote, "The human life is all one thing, like a blade tracing loops on ice. A little kid, a 23-year-old infantry sergeant, a middle-aged writer knowing guilt and sorrow." So a little kid, and he talks about a childhood incident he had. I'll get into that in just a minute. So a little kid, and then a 23-year-old in war, and then now a middle-aged writer knowing guilt and sorrow. So he talks about this story as a kid, and again, is it true, or is it fiction or nonfiction? But as a kid, there's a girl in school, Linda, and she has a disease, and kids are making fun of her, and he doesn't stick up for Linda in school. Linda's a friend of his. He doesn't stick up for her, and that haunts him. And he says, because of not sticking up for Linda, he did not pull Kiowa up in the war. Kiowa was another soldier, got trapped in the dirt, in the mud, and and the soldier had the opportunity to pull him out and just kind of froze. And he linked that back to not standing up for Linda in school. I thought that was a major connection, and then just how he brought that all back, and how it is this concept of daily habits. It's if you don't stand up for somebody when you're 10, it's that daily act of courage. It's going to be harder to do that act of courage during war. This is something that builds over a lifetime. It's not just that, like that quote I read at the beginning. It's not just you hope that courage builds up in this bottle by not doing anything, and then you hope it all of a sudden comes out when you need it. He says that's not the case, and it leads to a huge regret in the war.
Well, and that connects back to another book that we've already done, Natural Born Heroes, which has that as a big theme. And it, of course, is dealing with a few events from World War II in the more narrative part of that book. But one of the things that book is really exploring is that question of, like, what makes a person, like, how do these people who we wind up calling heroes, like, are they born heroes, or are they truly natural born heroes, or are they shaped? Is a person who becomes a hero because they've been training themselves and putting themselves in position to actually act and respond in a particular way when the need arises. And that's more where he comes with that is learning is when you're a 10-year-old, or when you're a 15-year-old, or when you're a 23-year-old, or whatever, you're constantly, even if heroism isn't required at that moment, you're constantly preparing for that moment, as though it were going to be needed at some time in the future. And then you are ready to actually to do that. And so his connection there does kind of connect nicely to another book that we've read. It also connects to some of what Jocko Willink talks about in terms of, constantly being combat ready in that regard. And his motivations and why he gets up so early in the morning and why he does whatever. You always want to be ready for that challenge. But at the same point, again, he comes back to and undoes some of that too, to say, yeah, but then what does it matter? Because because all of this is such a mess anyway, right? So it's an interesting meditation from beginning to end in that regard.
Well, and it's funny you bring up Natural Born Heroes, because I was thinking about that book this week, and it wasn't from thinking about the things they carried, but it was from another book. And I was thinking about the title again. I was like, why did he call it Natural Born Heroes? Because these people really weren't natural born heroes. It was more the daily habits that they were doing. It was the daily things they were doing. They weren't like these, they were born in Crete. Oh, okay, they're going to be heroes. No, it was daily decisions that they were making. It was how they lived. It was how they bounded around the rocks or whatever. But it wasn't this natural. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's culture. I mean, and again, this book gets us to having to think about culture, think about our culture, and think about the messiness of culture, daily habits, as you have in the notes, right? Daily habits, and something that the daily habits of a 10-year-old and the decisions of a 10-year-old wind up connecting in some way to the same decisions that to other seemingly unrelated decisions that same person's going to have to make at 23, and then that's going to influence how that person thinks as a middle-aged writer, knowing guilt and sorrow. So it's really interesting.
Yeah. One other part I just found fascinating was the first chapter.
Oh yeah.
And we're gonna include a podcast in the show notes. It was a Jocko Willink podcast, and he actually discussed this book, and he reads a whole chunk of this first chapter. But the book title is The Things They Carried, and the first section, the first short story of this book is the things they carried. And he talks about what all the people in a certain division carried in the war. And it was just a really fascinating way to look at a war situation. The things you carry, and especially in that kind of a situation where you're walking 10 miles a day, 20 miles a day in horrible conditions, you're not going to carry a lot. I remember going on a camping trip, and one of the guys had a backpack just full of stuff. And we were only about a mile in, and he opened up that backpack and just started throwing, 3/4 of his backpack away, like in the woods, because it was just too heavy. So when you're
never mind, leave no trace, right?
Yeah. But you are only going to take the things that are most important to you, and to think about what these soldiers are carrying with them. It was a really neat way to think about the war. But it wasn't just physical things they carried. He also talked about the terrible things they carried, the mental things they carried, the things they had seen. One quote: "They carried all they could bear and then some, including a silent awe for the terrible power of the things they carried." He also talked about carrying things too closely. One of the leader of the group carried a photo of a woman who didn't really care for him, but it was just kind of a way for him to escape the war in a way, and maybe when he got home from the war, this woman would be waiting, and it ended up being something that was bad for this guy, and so this idea too of carrying the most important things to you too closely can also be a burden. And one podcast I listen to is a podcast where Marcus Luttrell is one of the podcasters, and he's the guy for Lone Survivor. He's the lone survivor. If you've seen that movie, he's the Navy SEAL, and in that podcast he talks a lot about when he's in a war zone, he forgets about family completely. Like he can't carry that too closely in wartime because it'll just destroy him. He's got to just almost forget it as much as he can, and his family becomes the guys next to him, and that has to be his family. So just so many different ideas to consider when thinking about what you carry, physically, non-physically, the things that are really important that you want to carry, your family, your wife, your spouse, whatever, but that could also be something that hurts you in a war situation. Really just impressive chapter, and even if you don't read the rest of this book, like just reading that first chapter, it was something else, and really neat way to write a book about war.
Yeah. I not much to say, not much to add to that. I mean, again, that was it was a really, again, I was not quite prepared for what I was getting into when I read this book in terms of the style of it and what to expect, but it was not what I expected. And that chapter, I mean, it sort of hits you right in the face right away with like, wait, why is he just talking about what they carried? And then all of a sudden you start to see the relevance of it, and it connects back to a lot of the stories later on. It's again, it's very cleverly done, very well done throughout. Given that, I think we are at a point where we could probably begin to wrap up and get to the big picture here at the end piece. So let's get to some conclusions here.
All right. Well, I mean, I look at these books and I know I should probably be looking at how well was it written, and is it a good piece of literature? Is it a good book in that sense? But for me, my first initial reaction is always just did I like the book? And I loved this one. This is at the top of my list so far, towards the top.
By the way, as someone who does deal with literary criticism and so on professionally in this regard, your instinct is completely wrong. Screw how well it's written and all the literature, all this stuff. The true test of a book, the true test of any literary piece, is the effect it has on the reader. It's the effect it has on the person to whom the communication is being done. You can have all the rest of it, and you can say, well, mechanically, this book was not written as well as J.K. Rowling in some various places in the Harry Potter books. There are a few places where, grammatically, you could probably do this slightly differently, and it'd be a little bit more correcter. And you know what? She's a billionaire because of her ability to write and communicate with people and write stories that have wonderful effect on the reader. There's your test. We get too highbrow about this. That needs to be the first test.
Well, I think you nailed it with that the quotes you chose there for the story versus happening truth. And the other thought I had when reading this book is that he shows the absurdity of war without saying, "Hey, war is absurd." He doesn't have to like spit it out, but it's that idea between comparing the story truth and happening truth. You could write a book and put all over it, war is absurd, war is hell, war is horrible, but he does it in such a unique way that this is really, I think it's a really important book to read. I was talking to somebody and they said they read this in high school, and they got to class one day and the teacher had drawn the shades and had each, after they read the book, they had each student take out a piece of paper and I think do an exercise where they wrote home to somebody as if they were in the war, and just putting them in that mindset. But this person I was talking to, they were well out of high school at this point, and they said that book had stuck with them over the year because it was just such a unique book to them.
Yeah. As for me, I mean, I couldn't agree more in terms of the unique way of covering a war and making points in ways that are disarming. I think that's one of the things that this kind of writing does. And for those out there who want to do influential writing, I think O'Brien is a worthwhile writer to study because of his ability to get ideas across that, large portions of the population would probably be opposed to viscerally if he just made certain statements without the story attached. If he'd just come in and said, war is absurd, we shouldn't go to war, there's a lot of people that would just say, here we go, another one of those. But then when he establishes himself as a soldier and forces you to walk a mile in his boots, and then the second mile, and then dig a hole, and then fill the hole back up, and then walk the 2 miles back, having done nothing, you realize yourself, like, wait, war is kind of absurd. Like, why did he do any of this? And he makes the point without getting up the resistance of the reader. And that's a gift. That's a skill that takes a lot of development and a lot of very careful writing to get that across. I'll leave a couple other things here. A couple other quotes I wanted to finish with here. One is, again, this is how he displays that absurdity and the absurd mixture of heroism and goodness, and then the absolute evil involved in war. And he says, and he does that here in this particular quote, war is hell, but that's not the half of it. Because war is also mystery and terror and adventure and courage and discovery and holiness and pity and despair and longing and love. War is nasty. War is fun. War is thrilling. War is drudgery. War makes you a man. War makes you dead. And all of those,
wow,
all of those different statements in, the tension that's created by all of those true statements about war is his way of getting you at the truth about war. And to see the story truth, and he's doing that throughout, is trying to paint that picture so that you can see all of those aspects of war and the multifacetedness of it, and again, the multifacetedness of what it is to be human. So, and one other quote also I should have had in my favorite quote section, but I saved this one to the end. That I think, again, this really gets at something important in this book. He says, "If you don't care for obscenity, you don't care for the truth. If you don't care for the truth, watch how you vote. Send guys to war, they come home talking dirty." Ooh, right? So, I mean, this is a shot across the bow of lots of, white bread Americans who would, be averse to people using obscene language, whatever that means, actually, in front of their children, or talking about certain subjects, or, thinking about certain subjects. And these same people might vote readily to send people to war for whatever reason. And he's basically saying, listen, war is obscene. There's obscenity that you're exposed to with the killing of other people, which is what war is, and all that goes with it that you can't avoid. And you send men to war, you send guys to war, they come home talking dirty. And then beyond that, you can extend that further. Human life, our culture, there's a lot of obscenity in it. There's a lot of things that aren't very good. And to ignore that and to treat it as though we shouldn't talk about it because it's obscene is actually to do damage, because we should be talking about those things and trying to address it and treating it as true. And again, I love the way he gets that across in that quote, again, talking about these guys coming home in these specific ways after being scarred by what they saw. And he's saying, listen, stop pretending that we can clean everything up by ignoring it. And that's another worthwhile thing. I think you had one more thing before we finally wrap up.
Yeah. I'm going to add this book to my list of most influential war books. And the other two are also fiction books. I mean, I've read other nonfiction war books, but the three that have had the most impact on how I view war are fiction. And they are Catch-22, All Quiet on the Western Front, and then I would add this as the third book on really shaping my view of war. And, we were talking about the absurdity of war. Catch-22 does a great job of that, just on the bureaucratic side of what happens to the absurdity of war. All Quiet on the Western Front, of the absurdity of life as a soldier, and a German soldier in World War I in that case, and then this book about Vietnam War. Three excellent books about war, and really making you dig deeper in as we talk about not the glorious side of war, but really what happens to people, what happens to institutions, and what happens to individual soldiers, what happens in war. These three books do a great job of hitting on that. Yeah, and
I'll I guess wrap with one more quote here from the book that seems like a reasonable place to finish, and that is, in the end, really, there's nothing much to say about a true war story, except maybe, well, all right. That's going to do it for today. Before we get out of here, just a reminder that you can follow along with us at booksoftitans.com. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at Books of Titans. If you haven't already done so, subscribe to this podcast and find our past episodes in iTunes, the Android Marketplace, or your podcast manager of choice. If you're enjoying the podcast, tell your friends, give us a 5-star rating, review us on iTunes, and share your favorite episodes on social media. We'll be back to discuss the next book, which will be Iacocca, an autobiography. On behalf of Jason Staples, I'm Erik Rostad, and this has been the Books of Titans podcast. Thanks for listening. I made this.